The fog rolled in thick, swallowing the Golden Gate Bridge behind us. I could hear the low murmur of the boat's engine, the slap of water against the hull as we neared the infamous rock. Alcatraz. The island sat there, dark and hulking, a monument to lost souls and twisted minds, its crumbling walls holding memories better left forgotten. We were just a handful of tourists, drawn to the macabre like moths to a flame. Night tour, they called it. For those with an appetite for ghost stories, they promised a thrill. I wasn't sure why I came. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I just didn't have anything better to do on a Friday night. We docked. The guide, a pale, skinny man with hollow eyes and a voice too soft to trust, led us up the steep incline toward the prison. The wind howled, and the smell of salt and decay hung in the air. The others in the group, their faces half lit by their phones, huddled closer together as we entered the cell block. It was colder inside. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones, makes you feel like you're being watched. The guide told the usual tales, of escape attempts, of the riots, of the murders. His words floated through the air, barely cutting through the oppressive silence that clung to the halls. I was listening, but I wasn't. My attention kept wandering to the dark corners of the prison, to the shadows that seemed to shift when no one was looking. Something felt wrong. We reached solitary confinement. The guide stopped, turning to face us. "Step inside if you dare," he said, motioning to the pitch-black cell in front of us. His grin was too wide, his eyes too eager. One of the tourists, someone from the back of the group, decided to take the challenge. He stepped forward, the heavy door creaking as it opened. He hesitated just long enough for us all to catch the look of doubt in his eyes, but then he shrugged and stepped into the darkness. The door slammed shut behind him with a resounding clang that echoed through the block. There was silence. We waited. "Give him a minute," the guide said, checking his watch. "It can get to your head pretty quick in there." A minute passed. Then two. The air grew thicker, heavier, until it felt like we were breathing in wet cement. Someone shifted nervously. Another cleared their throat. 5 minutes. The guide knocked on the door. "You all right in there?" No answer. A creeping sensation crawled up my spine. Something wasn't right. The guide knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. He pulled out a set of rusted keys, fumbling with the lock. The door creaked open, the rusted metal groaning as it swung wide. The cell was empty. Everyone froze. The silence stretched too long. The space where the man should have been yawning like a black hole in the middle of the room. "Is this part of the show?" someone whispered, half laughing. But there was no humor in it. No one laughed with him. The guide stepped into the cell, his face pale under the weak light. He turned, facing us, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's gone!" But the way he said it, it wasn't just confusion. It was fear. Real, palpable fear. "Gone where?" a woman in the group asked, her voice shaky. "This is a prison. There's nowhere to go." We stepped closer, one by one, peering into the cell like it would explain anything, but it didn't. The walls were bare, the floor cold and unforgiving. There were no windows, no vents, no doors, just four walls and nothing else. And yet, he was gone, like he'd never been there at all. Then the lights flickered, and that's when we heard it. A slow, dragging sound like metal scraping against stone. The kind of sound that makes your teeth itch and your heart pound in your chest. It echoed through the empty halls, coming closer. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I could see the others reacting too, their eyes wide, faces drained of color. The guide was the first to move, bolting down the corridor, shouting over his shoulder, "We need to get out of here! Now!" Panic set in, and we followed. The sound of footsteps and the scrape of something. Someone, coming for us from the depths of the prison. The hallways twisted and turned, every corner looking the same, every step pulling us deeper into the maze. We ran, but no matter how far we went, the scraping sound stayed close, too close. We turned a corner, and there, standing at the end of the hallway, was the man from our group. His face was pale, his eyes empty, staring straight ahead. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. Just that awful dragging noise. Behind him, barely visible in the dim light, were shadows, twisted, contorted figures, their faces hollow, their hands reaching out. "Help me," he mouthed. But it wasn't his voice that filled the hall. It was something deeper, something darker. The lights flickered again, and when they came back on, he was gone. But the shadows? They were closer now, and they weren't shadows anymore. We were trapped, locked inside the prison with whatever was left of the men who died here, and they weren't interested in escape. They wanted revenge. The shadows were closer now. I could feel them, not just see them, an oppressive weight in the air, something unseen pressing down on my chest. My breath hitched as we stood there, frozen, unsure whether to run or scream. It was the woman from before who snapped us out of it. "We have to move," she hissed, tugging on the sleeve of my jacket. Her eyes darted toward the dark shapes that seemed to crawl along the walls, their grotesque forms becoming more distinct, more real with every second. The guide was nowhere to be seen. He'd taken off down another hallway, leaving us to fend for ourselves. Typical, I thought. He probably knew more about this place than he let on. "We need to find the exit!" one of the others shouted, his voice cracking as the panic set in. Exit. I couldn't even remember where we'd come in. The cell block stretched out in every direction, endless rows of steel doors all the same. The air was colder now, colder than before, like something was sucking the warmth out of the room. The floor beneath us trembled slightly, as though the island itself was shifting beneath the weight of the souls trapped here. Or maybe it was just our minds, unraveling bit by bit. We stumbled down another hallway, the heavy iron doors towering over us on both sides. I could swear the bars rattled as we passed, but every time I looked back, they were still, dead, but not quite. The woman in front of me stopped so abruptly that I nearly crashed into her. She raised a shaking hand, pointing ahead. "Look!" There, at the end of the corridor, was a figure. A man, hunched over, his face hidden in shadow. His back was turned to us, but there was something unmistakably wrong about him. His head twitched slightly, a jerking motion, as though he was struggling to control it. The sound of labored breathing echoed off the walls, harsh and ragged, like his lungs were filled with dust. "Sir?" one of the others called out, her voice wavering, but the figure didn't move. Not at first. I felt my heart stutter in my chest as the man slowly turned toward us, his movements stiff, unnatural. His eyes were gone. Just empty sockets, black holes where life should have been. His skin was stretched tight over his skull, pale and waxy, like he hadn't seen daylight in years. A prisoner, I thought, some long-forgotten soul still wandering these halls, clinging to what little remained of his body. And then he smiled. It wasn't the kind of smile you'd expect from something that looked half dead. It was wide, impossibly wide, splitting his face in two. His lips curled back to reveal teeth, sharp, jagged things that didn't belong in a human mouth. "Oh my God," someone behind me whispered. That's when the figure lunged. It happened so fast, a blur of movement. One of the men from our group didn't have time to react before the thing was on him, those teeth sinking into his shoulder with a wet, sickening crunch. His scream filled the hall, but it was cut short as the creature tore into him, dragging him to the ground. Blood sprayed across the floor, splattering against the cold stone walls, and I stumbled back, my stomach churning. The others ran. I could hear their footsteps fading into the distance, but I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the ground, eyes fixed on the thing tearing into the man like a wild animal. His body twitched once, twice, and then went still. It looked up, blood dripping from its chin, and for a split second, its hollow eyes met mine. A cold, piercing dread settled over me, deeper than anything I'd ever felt before. Then it turned back to its meal, uninterested in me. For now, I ran. My legs finally obeyed, and I sprinted down the hall, the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I caught up with the others in what used to be the prison yard, now just a wide-open space of crumbling concrete, with the moon casting pale light through the swirling mist. The woman was panting heavily, her eyes wide with fear. What the hell was that? No one answered. We all knew, deep down, that this wasn't some actor, some part of the tour meant to scare us. This was something else, something much worse. "That thing!" I gasped, struggling to catch my breath. "It's not the only one. There's more." Another man, pale and sweating, spoke up. "We need to get to the boat. If we can make it to the docks, maybe we—" His words died in his throat as the air around us shifted. It was subtle at first. A low hum, like the island itself was waking up. The ground beneath our feet trembled, and from somewhere far off, I heard the unmistakable sound of chains dragging across the floor. And then we heard the voices. They were faint at first, just whispers carried on the wind, barely audible. But as the seconds passed, they grew louder, more insistent. Multiple voices, overlapping, murmuring, crying, screaming, begging. The ghosts of Alcatraz. "Where are you going?" A voice whispered. So close I felt the breath on my neck. I spun around, but no one was there. "We can't leave," another voice moaned. This one coming from the ground beneath me, like the island itself was speaking. My heart raced, my mind spinning. I couldn't think straight. I couldn't breathe. "We have to move," I muttered, grabbing the woman's arm. She was frozen in place, her eyes wide, staring into the distance. I followed her gaze. There, standing in the mist, were the shadows again. Only this time they weren't just watching. They were coming. A dozen of them, moving slowly but deliberately, their shapes flickering in and out of view like candle flames. I couldn't make out their faces, but I didn't need to. The terror in my gut told me all I needed to know. We were being hunted. And then I heard it. From somewhere deep in the belly of the prison, a voice that didn't belong to any human. Something ancient, something angry. "None of you are leaving." The gates slammed shut behind us. The sound of the gates clanging shut echoed in the dead silence of the yard, and my heart dropped into my stomach. There was no escape. We were prisoners, just like the men who had died here. Their revenge wasn't a story to entertain us. It was real. The dragging of chains grew louder, reverberating through the walls, closer and closer. It was as if the island itself had come alive, breathing with us, pulsating with every fearful heartbeat. I turned back toward the prison block, pulling the woman along with me. "We can't stay out here," I whispered, though I wasn't sure why I was whispering. The dead didn't need to hear us. They already knew where we were. The others didn't argue. We bolted, scrambling back into the cell block, the heavy iron door slamming shut behind us. It was a mistake. I knew it as soon as the door clanged shut. But what choice did we have? We were sealed in with the ghosts of men who had died horribly, and now they were looking for company. The halls were darker now, the flickering lights barely illuminating the space in front of us. The walls felt like they were closing in, the shadows stretching longer, crawling across the floor and ceiling. Every step felt like we were walking deeper into a nightmare. And maybe we were. "Where's the guide?" the woman muttered, her voice barely more than a whimper. "He's supposed to know the way out. Forget him," the man snapped. "He's probably dead. We're on our own now." I didn't say anything. There was no point in giving false hope. I could feel the weight of something watching us, breathing down our necks, unseen eyes tracking our every move. This place, it was alive in a way no building should be. Alcatraz had taken on a life of its own, fed by the torment of the souls it had claimed. The hall stretched out in front of us, endless, with cells lining both sides, their barred doors hanging open like gaping mouths. I avoided looking inside them, afraid of what I might see, afraid that if I looked too long, something might look back. As we moved further down, the air grew heavier, colder. It wasn't just the cold of stone and salt water. It was the cold of the grave, the kind that made your bones ache and your breath fog in front of you. The lights flickered again, casting the walls in sharp relief, and for a moment, I saw them. Figures standing in the cells, just out of the corner of my eye. Emaciated, hollow-eyed men, staring with empty gazes that bore into my soul. Their mouths twisted into sneers of hatred, of hunger. Then the lights went out, completely. The woman screamed, a raw, guttural sound, but it was quickly stifled, as if someone had slapped a hand over her mouth. The silence that followed was suffocating. I fumbled in the darkness, reaching out blindly, feeling nothing but the cold stone walls. A voice whispered from the void, soft, broken, like it had been whispering for years without anyone to hear. "Please, let me out!" I spun around, heart racing, trying to pinpoint where it had come from. The darkness was too thick, too consuming. I could hear footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming toward me from the blackness. I backed up, my mind screaming to run, but my legs wouldn't move. "Help me. It's so cold." The voice was right next to me now, so close I could feel the breath on my neck. My entire body tensed, every instinct screaming that something was behind me. But I couldn't turn. I couldn't face it. The footsteps stopped. A sharp metallic clang rang out, followed by the sound of chains rattling. My breath hitched. The others, I couldn't hear them anymore, just silence. And then, the door at the end of the hall opened with a creak, spilling faint light into the darkness. I ran toward it, the shadows at my heels, something brushing against my leg as I moved, like a hand trying to grab me. I didn't stop. I didn't look back, not until I burst through the door into what I thought was safety. It was another room, large, empty, with barred windows lining the far wall. A faint light filtered through them, casting long shadows across the floor. The others were there, huddled together, their faces drawn and pale. The woman looked at me, her eyes wide with fear. "They're coming," she whispered, and then the door slammed shut behind me. The temperature plummeted, and the walls began to tremble, a low rumble vibrating through the stone. The shadows, those impossible shifting figures, poured in through the cracks, coalescing into something larger, something darker. A mass of writhing blackness, filled with the faint outlines of faces, faces of the damned. "They won't let us leave," the man said, his voice hollow, defeated. "We're just like them now." "No!" I shouted, backing away. "There has to be a way out." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The island wasn't going to let us go. Not alive. The shadows swirled around us, the air thick with the stench of rot and decay. And then, from somewhere deep within that mass of darkness, a shape emerged. Taller than the others, more solid, more real. It stepped forward, its face hidden beneath a hood, but its eyes, those hollow, empty sockets, glowed with a sickly light. "Prisoners," it rasped, its voice scraping like nails on stone. "Forever," the others screamed. I didn't. I couldn't. My throat had seized up, my body paralyzed with the kind of terror that freezes you to the spot, that makes your mind shut down. The thing moved closer, reaching out with skeletal hands, its fingers curled like claws. I felt them, cold as death itself, graze my skin, and I knew. I knew in that moment that there was no escape. We had become part of Alcatraz. The ground beneath us shifted again, and from somewhere deep within the prison, a door creaked open. But it wasn't an exit. It was an invitation to join the damned. And the worst part? I could feel it. The island pulling at me, whispering promises of peace, of rest. But it was a lie. The dead never rest here. Not on Alcatraz. The whispers were everywhere now, swirling around us like a storm, closing in. The walls seemed to pulse with the beat of something ancient, something alive. I could hear the chains rattling again, dragging across the floor, as if something enormous was moving beneath the earth, dragging itself toward us, pulling with it the weight of centuries of suffering, of violence, of madness. I could barely see the others through the haze of fear clouding my mind. The man was on his knees, head in his hands, muttering to himself. The woman had backed herself into a corner, her wide eyes fixed on the hulking figure that had stepped out of the darkness. The thing with the hood, the one that called us prisoners. It stood in front of us, its face still hidden, but I could feel its gaze, cold, dead, and unrelenting. It raised a hand, and from the darkness behind it, I saw them. More figures, more prisoners, their hollow faces twisted with anger, with hunger. They shuffled forward, dragging their feet, their chains clanking with every step. Some of them were missing limbs, others had gaping wounds in their torsos, but they moved with a purpose that chilled me to my very core. "Prisoners!" The hooded figure rasped again, its voice a death rattle. "You belong to us now." The walls trembled again, and with a deafening crack, the ceiling above us split open. Dust and debris rained down, and in the flickering light, I could see them. Hundreds of them. Faces pressed against the walls, peering through the cracks. Eyes that had long since gone dark, watching, waiting. I turned to run, but the door we'd come through was gone, vanished, as if it had never existed. The room seemed to stretch out, the walls distorting, twisting, until I couldn't tell where the ground ended and the shadows began. It was a nightmare, a labyrinth of horror that we would never escape. "Run!" I shouted, though I knew it was futile. My voice echoed back at me, swallowed by the oppressive darkness. The woman scrambled to her feet, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "We can't," she choked out. "There's nowhere to go." But I refused to believe it. I refused to accept that this was the end. I ran toward one of the barred windows, desperate, hoping beyond hope that there was a way out. I grabbed hold of the cold iron bars and pulled, but they didn't budge. Outside, the fog rolled in thick, obscuring the water, the sky, everything. It was as if the island was adrift in another world, cut off from reality. The hooded figure stepped closer, its skeletal fingers reaching out, and I could feel the coldness radiating from it. My breath turned to ice in my lungs, and my skin prickled with dread. "This is your cell now," it rasped. "Your eternal sentence?" I backed away, but there was no escape. The shadows, those twisted prisoners of the island, were all around us now. They moved slowly, deliberately, their faces contorted with the agony of centuries. They were close enough now that I could see the details. The sunken cheeks, the rotting flesh, the milky dead eyes staring through me. The man on the ground finally looked up, his face streaked with tears. "I can hear them," he whispered. "They're in my head. They won't stop. They want me to—" He never finished his sentence. One of the figures lunged forward, grabbing him by the throat. He screamed, a high, piercing wail that echoed through the cell block. But it was cut off as the figure dragged him into the darkness. His hands clawed at the ground, leaving bloody streaks as he was pulled into the shadows, disappearing as though the prison itself had swallowed him whole. The woman screamed, backing away until she hit the wall. The shadows surged forward, reaching for her, their hands grabbing at her clothes, her skin. She fought, but it was no use. They pulled her down, their fingers sinking into her flesh as she vanished beneath them, her screams fading into nothingness. I was alone. The hooded figure loomed over me now, its breath cold against my face. I could see the faint outline of something beneath the hood, a skull, its hollow eyes burning with a sickly, otherworldly light. "Your turn," it whispered. I braced myself, knowing there was no way out, no escape from what was coming. The cold grip of its fingers closed around my wrist, and I felt the icy burn of death crawling up my arm. But then, just as the darkness began to close in, a sound cut through the silence, a sound I hadn't heard since we'd arrived. The boat horn. It blared through the fog, loud and insistent. The grip on my wrist loosened, and the hooded figure recoiled slightly, its head snapping toward the sound. The chains rattled again, louder this time, as if the island itself was reacting to the horn. The door, the one that had vanished, suddenly reappeared, creaking open with a groan. The fog outside the barred windows began to lift, just enough for me to see the faint outline of the boat docked at the shore. The figure hissed, its grip tightening again. "You can't leave!" But something in me snapped. A surge of adrenaline, of desperate, wild hope pushed me forward. I yanked my arm free from its grip and bolted toward the door, not daring to look back. The chains rattled louder, the voices of the dead screaming in my ears as I sprinted through the cell block, my legs moving on instinct. I burst out into the night air, the cold wind biting at my face as I ran down the incline toward the dock. The boat was there, waiting, its lights flickering through the fog. I could hear the engine idling, the water lapping against the rocks. I didn't stop running. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift and tremble as I ran, but I kept going, fueled by the thought that I might just make it out. The whispers followed me, the chains rattling, but I didn't look back. I reached the dock, my lungs burning, my heart pounding in my chest. The boat was right there. Safety. Escape. But just as I reached out to grab the rail, something caught my leg. I looked down. A hand, cold, skeletal, and covered in decayed flesh, was wrapped around my ankle, pulling me back toward the island. I screamed, trying to shake it off, but it held tight, dragging me backward inch by inch. The boat began to drift away, the fog swallowing it whole. "No!" I gasped, clawing at the ground. "No, let me go!" But the hand tightened its grip, and I felt the cold of the island seeping into my bones. Then I saw it. The face of the man who had disappeared earlier, his hollow eyes staring up at me from the water, his lips twisted into a grotesque smile. "You're one of us now," he whispered, his voice a raspy echo in the mist. And with one final tug, the island claimed me forever.